Hello, hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I am your host, and I'm so thrilled to be here with another episode for you. A few months ago, I stumbled onto a TikTok, as one does, where somebody was suggesting that they are in some ways too smart for therapy, that they already know what's wrong with them. They already know what the problem is. They're just not able to get over the problem. And when they tried therapy, they found that they already knew what the therapist was going to say. They already know all this stuff. They've already read all the books, they've done it all. And so they're in some ways feeling like they are too smart for therapy, too advanced for therapy. Therapy isn't going to work for them because they already know what the problem is. And there's a way in which I think this way of thinking can really impede and get in the way of what we really most desperately want, which is to understand ourselves more deeply and to work through some of these deeply entrenched places within us. So I want to talk about if you find yourself in this place where, like, I know what's wrong. Why can't I move through it? Or if you're finding yourself, there's another place that I think we so often go, which is I understand why they did what they did. I get why my dad did that, my friend did that. I understand so deeply why they do it because I'm so intellectually, like, I'm so smart, I'm so well versed in psychology, like I know why they did it. So it's hard for me to then have any feelings about their actions. My understanding means that, like, how am I supposed to, like, get mad at people? I understand so deeply. If you find yourself in either of those two places, this episode is for you. And we're going to cover so much more than those two things, but those are the two kind of ideas that I've been playing with and wanted to kind of put down into a podcast episode. And before we get into the episode, this is a reminder that I do currently have spaces in my mentorship for depth coaches. In this mentorship, we have an opportunity not only to be in a group with other like-minded women to support each other as you're building ethical, people-first businesses, but you're also getting the support and mind and exploration into why people do what they do so that we can do our work in a more meaningful way. I call this supervision because because of my experience in the world of mental health and being a psychotherapist, I have found how profoundly potent it is to be able to use other people's minds to help us understand the work. We're really not meant to be doing this work by ourselves. And yet there really is very limited number of spaces in the coaching industry where we get to make sense of how to support the people in front of us without it just being another tool, another methodology, another checklist, another manualized way of working, helping people work through their problems. So my mentorship offers both the business, the practical, as well as this expanding our capacity to develop deeper coaching skills, deeper listening skills, so that we can do really meaningful work long term. If you're interested in learning more about my mentorship, you can go to thaissky.com/mentorship. The link is also in the show notes or down below in the comment section. And you're also more than welcome to reach out if you have any questions. Okay, so let's get into this topic of intellectualization, because essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about these two kind of ideas is the defense of intellectualization. We're intellectualizing, we know so much, and our knowing gets in the way of our feeling. And that's essentially what intellectualization is. It's where thinking is used to avoid feeling. It's when we are so brilliantly smart in our own minds that we use our thoughts, we use our understanding to, in some ways, avoid, push down, deny our vast internal experiences. To put it another way, it blocks us from our unconscious conflicts and affects. Now, in order for us to really understand what even that means, we have to go back in time and start at where intellectualization, this idea, came from. So it originates with Freud himself. When Freud was working with his patients, he was starting to sense that despite people wanting to get better, wanting to feel better in their lives, there were things that they were doing that was in a way resisting the work, that there were resistances inside of them to getting better. And that was really interesting to him. Why is it that we both want to get better and also don't want to get better? What is this conflict? What is going on there? And so he was playing with some ideas in some ways that we defend against ourselves. We defend against certain internal experiences. But he did not use the word intellectualization. That didn't happen until Anna Freud, his daughter, created her seminal work on defenses. She became very interested in diving specifically into all of the ways in which we defend against ourselves, defend against certain internal experiences. And it's important to note that the word defenses is meant to elicit, it is a military metaphor. And Freud loved military metaphors, whether it was because he was a man of his time at the beginning of the World War II, or also probably because it was steeped in culture. It was how we were understanding and seeing the world. But I think there's also something really cool about war metaphors, because I think it really helps us tap into just how much conflict exists within us, the ways in which we both know ourselves and also don't know ourselves. And this is at so much of the core of what Freud was exploring. How is it that we know so little of ourselves, that we say we want something, but we do things different? We do the opposite. We're manifesting all these symptoms that are very alarming, and yet we're doing everything we can to kind of hold on to these symptoms. So obviously now the idea of defenses have become very popularized. We say that somebody is defensive or defended. We use the word defense mechanism all of the time. And I think that that's in some ways quite cool, right? How infiltrated Freud's work has become into our society. But it also, once things enter pop culture, we start to lose nuance, and we start to lose an understanding of the complexity of a topic. And a defense like intellectualization is complicated. It's not so simple as just to say, oh, you're defending against a feeling. We want to get to understand what it is that was really happening inside. What feeling are we really defending ourselves? Like, what's going on there? And hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll have a deeper sense of maybe how you may use intellectualization, because I think in some ways this is a very, very common defense, especially in groups of people who tend to then listen to my podcast. Those of us who are seeking healing, who are into self-help, who are into understanding themselves, it's very seductive to fall into intellectualization. And so let's talk more about it. So Freud and Anna Freud were very interested in defenses. But before we move kind of more deeply into specifically the intellectualization defense, I want to break down this fear that I think we often have, that defenses are bad, that a defense mechanism is bad. It's something that we're doing that's wrong. We shouldn't have defense mechanisms. We should be able to feel all of our feelings, etc. And I want to slow that down for a minute and to think about it a little bit more deeply, because when we're thinking about defenses, I think it's important to note that any psychic process can be used as a way to defend against certain topics, ideas, feelings. Too much emotion, like getting so flooded with emotions in a therapy session, for example, can be used as a way to defend against some other feelings. Weepiness, or to be constantly crying but not really processing, can be a way that we're defending against something else. We can use defenses subtly and in overt ways to try to protect our most vulnerable and tender inner material. So defenses in and of itself is not a bad thing. It just is. We need defenses. We can't always be kind of open and constantly kind of in touch with the most difficult parts of ourselves and parts of living this human experience. And in fact, we sometimes see patients who part of what they're really struggling with in their lives is that they don't exert enough defenses, that things infiltrate too easily, and that can create kind of a really malleable inner outer world that can be very chaotic and very overwhelming. So defenses are not good, they're not bad, they just are, they're important for the mind. And it's a way in which, in some ways, the ways in which we defend against the difficult realities of life is very entrenched and baked into our personality. And that's what makes defenses so tricky. The minute you can name, oh, this is a defense mechanism, it is no longer unconscious. It's now a part of what you are knowing of yourself. And that removes some of its power. The difficulty is that a lot of our defense mechanisms are actually unconscious, and we don't even really know it's happening until someone points it out to us. And then it can be very confronting and very difficult. And so as a clinician or practitioner working with people, if you notice their defenses coming up, we want to be really sensitive. We don't want to just like bulldoze their defenses. We don't want to just push through it. We want to be very gentle and careful and thoughtful about how we navigate their defenses, because we use defenses psychically to protect ourselves against something much scarier. And in some ways, if our defenses are really baked into our personality and they're so embedded in how we understand ourselves in the world, to push down or push against a defense would be to push against the entirety of who we know ourselves to be. And that can be extremely threatening. And we may then kind of deteriorate or compensate in some other ways. So we want to be very gentle with ourselves and how we understand our defenses. And as practitioners, we want to be very gentle with what that looks like when it comes to working with clients. The problem, okay, so defenses are not good or they're not bad, they just are. Then what's the problem? Well, the problem is when a defense becomes very rigid and very baked in. What we tend to find as a psychically kind of healthy or adaptive mind is a mind who can move through the different types of defenses depending on the situation, and can, once they use a defense at some point in time, let's say in the crisis, they then move towards a processing of what happened, right? That they can acknowledge that while it may not have been appropriate to be overwhelmed and in touch with certain emotions in the height of the experience, they can then go back and reevaluate, reassess, and process, and get then more in touch with what was going on for them in that moment. So we see psychic wellness as a flexibility of when we can use different defenses and with the timing of the defenses. When we start to talk about like psychic unwellness or psychic deterioration or kind of rigidity, is when not only do we not see the defenses that we're using, but we're using the same ones in a very, very rigid way, in a very closed off way, with no space for interrogation and exploration. And that's probably why we're here doing this healing work, is because we get a sense of flavor of what happens when our defenses become too rigid or too intertwined with such a sense of self that any exploration into the defense deteriorates the self. We see the consequences of it, right? We see that it can shift into really difficult relational dynamics. We push away the things that we want. We get overwhelmed with self-loathing. We find ourselves constantly at war with our emotions and our minds, or we may block out intimacy and an emotional capacity for care. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to interrogate and examine and explore and notice when we're using what defenses. But I'm not going to cover all of the defenses. There's categorizations of defenses that can be helpful. I'm not here to really go in depth about defenses. I want to talk about intellectualization specifically. So we're going to stick to what we're here to do. But I think it's important to kind of give you a little bit of background of where defenses came from, and so that we can move more meaningfully into a conversation about intellectualization. Now, how do we know that we're using a defense? I'm quoting from Nancy McWilliams's book, Psychodynamic Diagnosis. And she writes, she's a thought leader, a really beautiful, potent writer, and her take on defenses has been very helpful for me. So she writes, a person using a defense is generally trying unconsciously to accomplish one or both of the following. the avoidance or management of some powerful threatening feeling, usually anxiety, but sometimes overwhelming grief, shame, envy, and other disorganizing emotional experiences. And 2, the maintenance of self-esteem. Especially those of us who really value our intellect, we feel like we're very intelligent, to allow ourselves to get overwhelmed by emotion may really then go against our sense of self, our self-esteem, our way of understanding the world, and that can be very, very threatening. So we know that we're using a defense when we find ourselves disconnected from our internal world. And we may find ourselves not shoring up enough defenses when we're just so deteriorated, so overwhelmed by our internal states. Okay. So let's talk about a few examples of how intellectualization may come up for you. It may show up as we talk about something and we talk about having a feeling about something without actually accessing a feeling. So we were maybe talking about something really scary that happened to us as children. You know, I came home one day and there was no one at home, and I got really angry because my dad promised me that he would be home, and then I sat alone for 5 hours in my dining room, not knowing where anybody was. Now, if somebody were to say that to you, you could imagine that that person, that child, may have had all sorts of thoughts and feelings go on, right? To be let down by their dad, to then be alone for hours and hours and not know when their dad was going to come home. And so we can imagine that if somebody were to have experienced that, they were to have a lot of emotions. But if somebody's telling it to you quite emotionless, without it stirring anything up for them, without them kind of getting in touch with any of the emotions of what they may experience, that may be a sign that intellectualization is at play when they're talking about really big feelings rather than feeling those really big feelings. And I'm talking specifically in like a therapy space. I'm not saying that like we have to always be emoting when we're talking about things with friends, colleagues, etc. I'm talking specifically if we're supposed to be, we're in a space where we are ultimately wanting to kind of work through some of our internal stuff, and yet we're talking as if we don't actually have any feelings that are coming up. That may be a sign that intellectualization is at play. Another one is the example I started the podcast with. You know too much psychology when you can't get mad because you understand everyone's reasons for doing anything, right? So I can't get mad because I understand why they did it. This is such a beautiful example of intellectualization because your understanding is blocking you from the experience of feeling, but it's done in such a way that it makes you feel like you're actually morally superior, like you're actually like a better, more evolved human. Like I can't get mad. Like being mad is something that like the plebeians do. People who can't get a hold of their emotions, who are just so messy, they're the ones that are getting mad. I can't get mad because I am so understanding, right? Like we can sense that there's something that makes us feel like we're better than other people because we're so understanding. But just because we may understand why somebody did something doesn't necessarily mean we're not also having feelings about it. I'm so self-aware that there's no point in therapy because I already know my problem. The tricky with this, the tricky part of this is that the fantasy of what therapy is that therapy is about knowing what our problem is. And that may be a part of it for some people, to know what caused what they're experiencing. That may be part of the process, but that's not by no means like what therapy is meant to be, or what allows therapy to really heal or touch or expand within us. It's not just about knowing. If we're finding ourselves even using these words like I think, I know, I understand too often without any recognition of the emotional landscape underneath it, that may be an invitation that intellectualization or rationalization may be at play. That's a different defense that we're not going to get into today, but just saying it's not necessarily all intellectualization if you are finding yourself very head heavy. It just is one of many different types of defenses. But intellectualization is really, really tricky because our society celebrates it. Our society touts, values rationality over emotions, particularly if you are of oppressed identity. Oftentimes, using emotions is a sign of weakness from the kind of more white patriarchal narrative. And if you're emotional, then you're not a good leader. If you're emotional, then you make emotional decisions, and those are bad decisions. Those are wrong decisions. You shouldn't make emotional decisions. There's so many subtle ways in which our culture values rationality, which is ironic then that the leaders of this country and many, many leaders of the world are actually making very emotional decisions. But this is the danger when we're not giving space for our emotions, is that our emotions that are actually the ones running the show, we're just hiding it from ourselves. That is the power of the unconscious. Just because you're not recognizing that there is an unconscious, just because you're not recognizing your emotional landscape, doesn't mean it's not there, doesn't mean it's not doing something, running the show, impacting you. Using a defense and believing that it means that you're morally superior doesn't actually take away the feelings. It just disconnects yourself from your own experience. It doesn't make you better. But that's not what our culture says. And so intellectualization is very much valued. And we can often see how it's such a containing way to make sense of such difficult experiences. If you went through a really turbulent childhood, but you use intellectualization, like, look how beautiful the defense can work in terms of it makes you feel like you're in control because you're able to think, you're able to stay in your mind. It helps you feel in control because you can kind of defend and protect other people's behavior, right? Like, I understand why they're doing it, so I can't have feelings about it. Now, suddenly, the only way that you know how to navigate your feelings is for you to control your own emotions rather than entering the relationship, entering the dynamic with the other person. Because if we're assuming that we understand why someone is doing something, we're then actually not curious to know what their reasoning are. But the fantasy of that understanding is really a projection. We're really projecting what we think happened to that person onto them and then relating to them as if that projection were true. The only way we can know why someone did something is if they share it with us, for the most part, right? So the intellectualization can help us feel like the world is more in our control. There's like an omnipotent quality to it that can feel really seductive. We can then make sense of the chaos of life in a way that supports our beliefs and our way of seeing the world. And because we can then get so caught up in our own mind and so validated by what we find, it's very hard to criticize. It's very hard to for another person to help us go deeper into ourselves. It's a very, very strategic defense that can actually be very tricky to work with and to experience. And of course, I'm speaking so much of this from my own experience. I think I use intellectualization quite often. I think I catch myself doing it quite often. And I find that when I use it, I feel safer in the world. Because again, those of us that use this defense, what we've been taught or what we've been communicated or what we've been modeled is that our emotions are messy, our emotions are disorganizing, our emotions are too much, they're chaotic. And so, of course, using our mind and staying in our minds rather than trying to develop a deeper language for our emotional experience is the only way to go. Yes? Okay. The final example that I have here, and I know that there are so many more examples of intellectualization and how it may show up, but one of the ways that I see it show up very, very often in the self-help, self-idealization, spiritual coaching, psychology communities is if I learn everything there is to know, I will master this. Ooh, that's a really, really popular one. If I read all of these self-help books, if I listen to all of the podcasts, if I can just know what's going on, if I can just have these ahas and these breakthroughs that are all happening in the mind, then I will heal, right? Then I will master my emotions. Then my emotions will fall in line. And as we as we endeavor into doing it, the problem is that we read all these things, we know ourselves, quote unquote, so deeply, and yet we're still stuck in these habitual, painful patterns. And that's because knowing a pattern is not necessarily the same thing as breaking a pattern. It may be a step in pattern breaking to know it's happening and to understand why it's happening. But in and of itself, our minds we can't heal just through thinking. It just, if we want to expand what we know of ourselves, we must be willing to dip our toes, our ankles, our knees, our legs, our body into the ocean of our emotional experiences. Our emotions are filled with information and data and insight and brilliance. It's very, very overwhelming, though, if we have been taught that that is not a safe place for exploration. So, intellectualization, like I said before, it's not a bad thing. Defenses are not a bad thing. And in fact, it can be quite useful to intellectualize when we're in moments of crisis and moments of stress. There's actually something really useful, powerful about being able to stay in our minds when we're in a stressful environment. But if you never give yourself space to then go back and process, it's going to come at a cost. Intellectualization and all of these defenses, they come at a cost. And it often then keeps things unprocessed, and it festers, and it pulls us under, and then we wonder why we're experiencing anxiety, depression, listlessness, and all sorts of other symptoms that often points towards us not processing and experiencing what's going on for ourselves internally. Think of intellectualization as, well, yeah, I'm thinking of war metaphors. Of course I am. As like the walls around a castle. Sometimes we need those walls. Sometimes when we're getting attacked, when something is spiraling and breaking apart, we need to protect ourselves. But if we never lower the drawbridge, if we never let anything else in, and if we never give ourselves space to go deeper into the castle and understand what's going on there for ourselves, we're living a quite shallow existence. Yes. And that's the cost. So, part of the fantasy of intellectualization is that we can think our way out of pain. But thinking is not the same thing as processing. And there's all sorts of ways in which the mind justifies thinking over processing, over feeling, over getting more in touch with what's going on for us emotionally. And one of the ways is by believing that we're too self-aware. There's this pride. We know too much of ourselves, actually. And because we're so self-aware, no one can really help me. Oh, what a deliciously kind of closed loop system that is, right? Think about this. If I'm so self-aware, what I'm essentially doing is I'm saying that anybody's experience of me is so threatening, is so terrifying, that I'm going to bolster who I am and keep everything else out. I'm going to bolster who I am by thinking I know everything about myself, and maybe reading and doing that at my pace where I can control the information. But if somebody brings in something new, I'm going to defend it and deny it, because I can't imagine that other people could know something of myself that I don't know of myself. So it's a way to protect against intimacy, against impingement, against the other person's mind potentially controlling us, because that's the fear, right? That if the other person knows something of us that we don't, then it's going to threaten something of ourselves. And so our self-esteem is predicated, is based on or built on this sense that if anybody comes in, they're gonna threaten us. And so we have to develop this thick skin of self-awareness, hoping that way, if anybody says something to us, we already know. You can't surprise us. I'm going to get ahead of it. I know I'm stubborn. So if you say that I'm stubborn, it doesn't impact me because I already know. I'm too self-aware. In fact, for help, the irony there, of course, is that we say that, but we're not actually available for help, because that would be too threatening. So we're going to justify why we don't need help. And we don't need help because nobody can help. If nobody can help, we don't have to be in touch with our needs. Needs comes out of an affect or an emotional place. Needs and relational dynamics are all built out of our understanding of our emotional landscape. Because needs, when we're talking about needs in the context of relationships, we're talking about emotions, being attuned to, being met, being loved, being liked, being listened to. These are all emotional experiences. And so if we're saying, I'm too self-aware, I can't get help, boom, now you don't need help because you can't get it. And if you can't get it, you don't have to be disappointed by not having it. The irony, of course, is that this intellectualization defense of being so self-aware actually defends us from knowing more of ourselves and letting other people in. It defends us from other people's exploration of us, again, because that's too threatening. But that's the irony, is that we're actually using intellectualization, but we're not really allowing more in. We're not letting more knowing in because we think we already know it all. But again, this goes against everything that Freud built and beyond. I mean, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic thinking has moved so beyond Freud at this point, but the core of what he thought stands, which is that so many of us are in conflict with ourselves. We don't even know how much of ourselves we don't know. And that's just true of all of us. There are things that are too scary, too threatening for us to be able to hold in our mind, so they go away. They go out of awareness. But those things that are out of awareness are still impacting us. They're still underneath the surface. They're there still. And so we can't actually possibly know ourselves fully. That's not, I think, ever. We're always going to have things that we're in and out of awareness of. And so, but intellectualization teaches us or pretends that information is finite and it will come from the outside in a way that we have to manage, that we have to control. And then once we know so much of ourselves, we can't experience pain. We're going to be more control of our pain. But like I've been saying, it just doesn't work that way. And it protects us from all of the softness of the human experience. A lot of the ways in which play and creativity exists cannot happen when we're too deeply intellectualized. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay. Using a lot of jargon and fancy terminology is often a way that we're displaying insecurity and a lack of confidence. And this is another subtle way that intellectualization may happen. If we're finding ourselves using a lot of jargon words, hiding behind terminology, I mean, that makes sense, right? We're posturing. We're trying to kind of show that we're so smart, we're so brilliant that that we're like peacocking. We're showing everybody just how big we are. And of course, that most likely comes out of a low self-esteem, a sense that we have to prove our intellect to people. And so oftentimes, when someone is they really know what they're talking about because they're using very simple language. They're using language that's very relatable. And for coaches and practitioners, this is maybe something to keep in mind. And I see often in the coaching industry that it is the coaches that use the most jargony words, that are trying to kind of prove that they know so much about whatever, the nervous system. They're often really compensating for their insecurity. And that is where something like the mentorship may be really useful. Okay. Another point here that I wrote down is that being smart isn't a sign of being well. And this is a little scandalous because I think, again, our culture really puts a lot of power on intellect and smartness. And if you're really smart, then you must be psychically well. But that's just not the case. And it's very, very seductive to believe that that is the case. We can really trick ourselves into thinking that we're healing, that we're doing the work, when really we're just thinking, we're just knowing more. And I quoted this, and I wish I put a reference of where I found this, but speculating about one's own problem rather than experiencing them and attempting to change. That's often a sign that intellectualization is at play. That's not to say, again, it's not to say that understanding ourselves, thinking about our problems doesn't have merit, doesn't have use, is an important part of the process. But if we're doing that constantly, where we're only just trying to understand, but not actually trying to experience, if we're trying to use understanding as a way of experiencing, we're missing something. There's something else going on that we're trying to protect ourselves from. And so being smart is not a sign of being well. Being smart is a sign that you have a higher IQ. Does it mean that you're better than people? No. Does it mean that you're more into like further along on the spiritual path? No. Does it mean that you're incapable of experiencing pain? No. Nope. 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 Your intellect is not a measure of your health. I already said that in a different way, but it can be challenging to get help when we need to push people away through our intellect, which is in some ways exactly the purpose of it, right? I already said something of this nature a little bit earlier. It can really be challenging to get help, because to get help, and I talked about this in my gratitude episode, part of what it means to get help is to open ourselves up to the possibility that there's something that we lack. And for us who intellectualize, that can be really, really threatening. We use self-awareness, we use knowledge, we use concepts and ideas to bolster ourselves, because for many of us, we're terrified of what we lack. But to need help, to open ourselves up to help, to get help from a therapist or a practitioner of any kind, requires us to admit that there's something that we don't have. And that can be very terrifying. And so we don't do it by substantiating our intellectualization defense by saying we're too self-aware. We're too self-aware. And then there's no point in getting help. There's no point in therapy, because I already know about my problem. And for practitioners, this can be very tricky to work with, right? This defense can be very tricky, because if we're not getting supervision, if we're not paying attention, if we're not really grounded in what's happening in our transference and countertransference, what can happen is we can get sucked into an intellectual conversation, which for many therapists who are intellectual, that can also feel very delicious. Like, here's a client who just wants to know more about philosophy and science, and they want to pontificate, and they want to kind of talk about these ideas. And then we can sometimes find ourselves getting easily sucked into it. Like, oh yeah, let's just talk about trauma as if it's a concept that happens out there, rather than something that's happening in here and that's alive in the room and worth exploring as it's coming up for the client in the moment. So it can make the coach or practitioner or therapist or whomever feel really good. In some ways, intellectualization defense can make the practitioner feel really good, because it can be exciting to think about these things. But we want to be very, very careful, because if we're not recognizing it as a defense that it is, then we're colluding in the bypassing of the actual work. And I think that's why that TikTok existed, where that person said, I'm too self-aware and therapy can't help me. Probably because therapy hasn't helped that person. Probably because therapists got sucked into that intellectualization defense. I've even heard, right, of some therapists expressing some sort of like, yeah, your problem. There's not much more I can do to help you, because you already know so much about your problems. That is a collusion with the defense in believing that knowing ourselves is all that there is to this work. Okay, let's see. What other final points do I have here? One of the things that I brought up at the beginning also is I understand. So I understand who they are. I understand why they did what they did. And so it's I can't get mad about it. I literally quoted that from somebody who actually said that. So I know that this is a common thought, a common way. I can't get mad. And it's like, why can't you get mad? Why is understanding that person in the way of you getting mad? This is where it can be helpful to think about our internal landscape as multifaceted and holding inconsistencies, holding dichotomies, holding many things can be true at the same time. I can understand that my that my mother treated me the way her mother treated her. And then I can have empathy then for my mom for that. I can see that she is a victim in her own way. Uh, and, and, and can that mean also that I was victimized and that I'm in pain and that how my mother treated me really, really hurt me? So can both these things be true? And again, I talked about this more deeply in the gratitude episode. If we're only using gratitude or understanding or empathy to dismiss, devalue our experience, then we're doing something here, right? Then there's something worth exploring here. If we're saying like, I can't get mad because I understand, and then you never allow yourself to get mad, then you're denying something of yourself, which is that we can understand and we can be mad. Both things can be true. Why can't we be mad? Somebody hurt us. Why can't we be mad? We can know why they hurt us. We can still be mad. I mean, it's in some ways a cultural consequence of prioritizing the rationality and believing that there's something wrong with our emotions, and that having emotions is a nuisance and it's messy and it's an inconvenience. Then how beautiful it is if we can find ways to justify why we shouldn't feel a certain thing because we understand. But the mad doesn't actually go away. It just goes unconscious, and then it will come out in different ways. And so why should we work on this? Why should we tackle this? Why should we examine our intellectualization defense and the ways in which we may use our understanding as a way to bypass our experience? Well, because, Nancy McWilliams says sex, banter, artistic expression, and other gratifying adult forms of play is truncated. And I think that speaks to it all. Play, adult play, the way in which we can engage in intimacy and joy and artistic and emotive expressions are next to impossible if we're devoid of any emotional experience, right? If we're so devaluing and dismissive of our pain, then we can't then also experience all of the beautiful ways that human beings can relate to each other. And the tricky thing about intellectualization defense is that we then tend to devalue the consequence. Well, I don't need that. I don't need those things because I have my books. I don't need those things because, and that's just not true. It's coming at a cost, and it's often preventing us from experiencing the intimacy and the beauty that our very short existence has to offer. It also offers, when we're intellectualized, it creates a flavor of emotional dishonesty where people feel like we're not authentic. It can feel dissonant when we're not honest. It can feel dishonest, and we may not believe that we're being dishonest. They may not be malicious or intentional, but if we're not allowing ourselves to have emotions about certain things that are happening, and then we're trying to say that we don't have emotional response to it, it can come off as a lie. And people can feel that, and they can feel that there's something not quite genuine about that individual. And I think that then makes it hard for people to make emotional contact with us. It can make it hard for a true closeness to occur that comes out of being seen and heard and supported and validated and attuned to and loved. And of course, the kind of why should you, or the final kind of big point here is that intellectualization makes it difficult for us to work through our emotional pain. Our pain doesn't go away, though. It just stays hidden, and it runs rampant in our lives. And I think that those of us who intellectualize, especially who are then intellectualize and honor healing work, I think that puts us in a double bind. We both want to heal, but want to do it our way, want to do it with us being in control, want to do it by bypassing, without actually going into these deeper emotional levels. And it just doesn't work that way. Part of the healing work is to examine what we are afraid of. And that means moving beyond the mind and moving into our more emotive, emotional, softer parts of ourselves. But if we are doing it in the presence of a sturdy other, if you find a therapist that's able to work with you through this defense and help you understand it and help you name it and know it and get familiar with it, really magical things can take place. We're not we're not beyond healing because we use this one defense. Like, we're not that special. You're not that special. Like, you're not too smart. Like, come on, we've like we're just not that special. That kind of has a flavor like this narcissism, like I'm so much better than everybody else. And that's just a fantasy, and it's not true. The truth is that we can all find ways to deepen more into ourselves. Okay, so I hope that this is helpful for you. So the answer to the question, are you too smart for therapy? No, no one is. But if you find yourself being that way, it's worthy to examine. Is there a mismatch with you and the therapist? Is there an intellectual defense going on? Like, is there something that is getting in the way of potentially getting into contact with something deeper within yourself? Is there a fear of what that would be? All worthy questions to explore. Thank you all so much for being here for another episode of Reclaim. If you're watching this on YouTube, hi, hello. Please subscribe and like and do all the things that I feel like every YouTube person says. And if you're listening to this via the podcast, thanks so much for being here. If this podcast has meant anything to you, I would really appreciate a review, a like. It means so much to the algorithms. So thank you so much, and I will talk to you all soon.